welcome back for our afternoon presentations and defenses of Capstone. We'll begin this afternoon with Mr. Patrick Fontenot. His thesis statement is this: recentering local communities as the bedrock of American culture will ultimately restore America to its fundamental principles as envisioned by the Founding Fathers. Please welcome Patrick.
In Chicago, in 1995, a devastating heat wave struck the city. The extreme temperatures impacted millions of Chicago residents. But as a result of this natural disaster, over 700 Chicago citizens died. A group of researchers who studied this traumatic event found that these deaths were not merely a cause of the extreme temperatures, with the heat index remaining at or above 100 degrees for 5 straight days, even hitting 125 degrees one day. Rather, they blamed these deaths on the lack of community in Chicago neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the same city, but in a different neighborhood, the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood, had a very low mortality rate, one of the lowest in the city, even lower than many affluent neighborhoods who had adequate resources to respond to this crisis. This is a direct result of the strong community in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood. One analyst observed sidewalks, stores, community organizations, and adequate housing had nurtured a community where residents knew one another and checked on the elderly, sick, and vulnerable. In this neighborhood, due to their intentional formation of community and reliance on it, many citizens' lives were saved. During the same natural disaster, community directly saved citizens' lives while isolation resulted in their death. A close-to-home example in Louisiana, during the 2016 floods, many citizens were trapped in their homes or on their roofs with seemingly no escape. A brave group of citizens, known today as the Cajun Navy, chose to ride back out into the roaring winds and waves, risking their own lives to save their neighbors. In one such scenario, the mother of a family who had just been rescued offered to pay their rescue. But his response was, "I don't want your money, ma'am. I just want you to remember that down here we don't turn our backs on our neighbors in times of need. This is a bad deal, but we as a community are stronger than whatever floodwaters, winds, or whatever else is thrown at us." Community is necessary in the life of the American citizen. Founders such as Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison understood and highlighted the importance of community for the American citizen. However, today, many negative aspects have entered the American social sphere, destroying community and thus destroying America. Therefore, recentering local communities as the bedrock of American culture will ultimately restore America to its fundamental principles as envisioned by the Founding Fathers. Since the first settlers landed in the Americas in the 1600s, there's been an understanding of community as a necessity. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, they signed what's today known as the Mayflower Compact. In the Mayflower Compact, they write, "By these presents, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation." These words they use, one of another, ourselves, for our better ordering, these are plural words, these are communal words. The Pilgrims understood that in order for their society to flourish in the New World, they would have to rely on each other, and so this is how they chose to establish their government. The government of the United States was founded on the principle of self-governance, with, as Madison would say, morality as a prerequisite to this self-governance. Thomas Jefferson writes that we should subdivide and divide these republics from the great national one down through all its subordinations until it ends the administration of every man by himself. He champions the idea of subsidiarity, the idea of bringing things down to the lowest level possible. He supports the decentralization of government and the granting of those governing powers to each individual man. However, Jefferson does not merely support self-governance, but he also understands community's importance. He praises citizens who unite themselves by uniting their wills on the common good. And he in fact says that he considers society to be one of the natural wants with which man has been created. Jefferson desires a self-governing man, but understands that the self-governing man must live in community. Man must govern himself within the bounds of community. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French philosopher, fascinated by the American project and its success, came to the United States to study it. While here, he observed that he saw the American citizen living by what he called the principle of self-interest rightly understood. That is, American citizens were sovereign individuals who governed themselves, and yet they always considered the common good of their neighbor. Their self-governance, their self-interest was rightly understood within the bounds of the common good of their community. Community directly influences and builds self-governance. A group of individuals united together on the common good actually allows each individual man to govern himself better. Of course, every man may have to give up a certain amount of his rights and liberties to pursue the common good of the whole group. But first and foremost, this is affecting the common good of the community, which is the highest good. Second, he is able to learn from the wise and the elderly in his community. And thirdly, by taking in that wisdom and exemplifying it in his own life, he's able to provide a good example for his descendants. Man in a community has what's been called independent interdependence. He is autonomous with his own self-interest, but at the same time rightly understands this. He relies on those in his community and must seek their good. Now, what exactly is a community? I offer the following synthesized definition of community, that it is a voluntary association of individuals united by a common ideal and dependent on each other that springs from the past and prepares for the future. Community is where man develops this idea of what it means to be human. If raised in a community with a strong moral foundation directed by wisdom and the common good, he in turn will learn what it truly means to be a human. What it means to live an upright, ethical life, how to self-govern well, but how to understand that self-governance within the bounds of the common good. However, if community begins to fail, every citizen's ability to self-govern begins to fail, and as a result, America, which is built on this self-governance, begins to fall apart. A recently published survey found that today, almost 2/3 of Americans would say they aren't sure about their neighbors, compared to the under 1/3 who would say they do trust their neighbors. Around 40% more people distrust than trust their neighbors. And this statistic alone is 8 times higher than in 1972. As this rate of social trust continues to decrease, time spent with neighbors consequently decreases. This same survey found that less than 1 in 5 Americans would say they spent time with their neighbors once a week, compared to the almost 1/3 who would say they never spend any time with their neighbors. Robert Putnam's famous essay, Bowling Alone, outlines many of the social occurrences that have caused this radical destruction of community, leading to much isolation. He investigates how the American has gone from participating in the vibrant bowling clubs of the 50s and 60s to today, bowling alone. He details many aspects that have harmed American communities, but there are 2 in particular that have been especially detrimental, that being a hyper-focus on economics and suburbanization. First, economics, specifically profit-centered economics. Economics in and of itself is a neutral reality. It's simply the science that deals with the transfer of goods and services between individuals. However, economics centered merely on profit has a central goal of efficiency. It sees every individual as merely a means to the end of production. There is no understanding of the importance and dignity of each human being who then engages and participates in his own community. Instead, he is seen as simply a cog in the machine to do work and output products. A tragic example of this mentality is in Larry Summers, a previous economic advisor to the Obama administration. He once stated that he believes a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. He continues, I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage countries is impeccable. That means without sin, without fault, and we should face up to that. He believes that it is reasonable to dump toxic waste in poor countries so that richer first world countries such as America can be as productive as possible. He has lost track of what it means to live in community, and as a consequence, what it means to self-govern oneself and one's own desires within the bounds of the common good. Secondly, suburbanization. Suburbanization is the movement of people from traditionally designed neighborhoods with homes and businesses to the suburbs, which consist solely of houses to live In a traditional community, man lives near those he spends his time with, those he works with, attends church with, goes out to eat with. He spends his free time with those whom he lives with, and therefore is interested in them and invested in their good, which is the common good. This forms a strong community. However, in the suburbs, man lives with some people, but works with others, goes out to eat with others, attends church with still others. He therefore feels no real connection to any of these communities, and so does not feel compelled to seek any of their common good. This man has no true community. Suburbs can tend to break people apart and cause isolation, since they typically have no true community. Therefore, the solution to myriad problems facing America today is to rebuild communities. This certainly is a daunting task, but if done as a communal effort, the burden will be much lighter. A recent Gallup poll published in 2021 found that around 50% of Americans would prefer to live in the country or a small town, which frequently have this communal milieu. Two organizations that exist solely for the purpose of promoting and encouraging communities are Happy Cities and Strong Towns. These think tanks examine current trends and designs in cities and how these have positively or negatively affected American communities. They then provide ideas and resources to encourage the beneficial practices while solving the negative ones. One idea they promote to solve the destruction of American communities is the X-Minute City. The X-Minute City is an infrastructure design in which everything needed for daily life is within an X-minute walk away, normally about a 15 to 20 minute walk. This includes things such as stores, churches, schools, doctor's offices, and restaurants. All of one's daily necessities would be within a walkable distance away from one's home. This is extremely beneficial for the formation and flourishing of communities. As detailed above with the traditionally designed neighborhoods, when a man is able to live near those he spends his time with, he truly is interested in them and invested in their good, and thus contributes to a strong community that seeks the common good. The Founding Fathers envisioned a society that could be described by de Tocqueville's epithet of self-interest rightly understood. They saw that community forms ethical men who can effectively participate in the democracy of the country. Unfortunately, today, many negative attributes have entered the American social sphere, thus causing the destruction of community as we know it. As this fundamental pillar of the nation collapses, the nation falls with it. Every American citizen has a duty to assess the current situation in America today and to see the many problems occurring. A tragic example being that over 700 Chicago citizens can die alone with no family or friends anywhere around to help them. He must then identify that ultimately horrible situations such as this are caused by a lack of community, and therefore must endeavor to rebuild his own community. There are many practical ways to rebuild one's community, but this can include things such as simply getting to know one's own neighbors, introducing yourself, talking to them on a regular basis, or inviting them over to dinner. It could be other things, like supporting small family-owned businesses, attending farmers markets to support local farmers. It could include joining fraternal organizations such as the Knights of Columbus, Lions Club, or Kiwanis Club. Another practical way to help your community is by investing in rebuilding your local John Paul the Great Academy's roof by donating to Solar Giving Day 2023, which is today. It can be inconvenient to consistently choose to shop and support local and really invest time in one's neighbors. However, these small steps are essential to the building up of the American community. The founders understood the necessity of community for their American project to flourish. The citizen of today has a duty to heed their wisdom and endeavor to rebuild his own community, to honor his ancestors and provide a vibrant future for his descendants. Thank you.
We'll begin with faculty questions.
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Patrick, for that presentation. Historically, in American, especially in larger cities, the communities that you referenced, they had a certain homogeneity to them. So they were like the Irish Catholics or the German Protestants, and there was a binding that they shared. They were united by a common ideal, like you defined in your definition. Given the fact that in our current American society, pluralism, the idea that there's so many different ideas and thoughts and views and religious beliefs, etc., in larger cities in particular, how do you envision this happening? Like, what will be that common ideal? What would that look like practically in a space that was very diverse?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So one, I guess, maybe practical example of this could look like, so right, in New York, they have the borough system. The borough system is basically, New York is divided into these many boroughs, and frequently people describe these as feeling very communal. They feel very connected to their neighbors, they know them. So it could include something like that where community is very much founded on the idea of location and physical location. So obviously it's correct that there's a lot of diversity in America today, but in things such as like really focusing on those who really live near you, those that you see a lot, and really by like investing in local people, local businesses, people that you live near, is one way that these communities can be formed in bigger cities, by focusing on those who live close to you, not those who live the opposite corner of the city. Mr. Anson.
Thanks, Patrick. The Salem witch trials offer an interesting counterpoint to your examples that you used. In colonial Massachusetts around 1692, 200 men and women were accused. 19 of them hanged, one man was pressed to death, and 5 others died in jail. I'm curious if you could speak to whether or not you think this community contained the self-interest rightly understood that you talked about, or if something went wrong there, what might have happened. And some people would even blame superstition or even religion as the culprit in that case.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so the Salem witch trials, right, people would say that they had this, maybe it would be considered to be a strong community, it would seem that way, but I think in this, what really caused this, I guess, was maybe a over-focus on the communal aspect. Maybe there was less individuality. It was this idea that everything everyone did directly affected the community. While this is true, the people were not in themselves, they weren't individual, they were just a part of the greater body, they had no individuality. So in that sense, whenever something suspicious would happen, it kind of just affected this hysteria, and everything just went crazy because this community was too tight-knit, maybe we could say. There was no individuality. So I think maybe that could explain how it seemed there appears to be this community, but in a sense it's not healthy because there's not this self-interest part that there are individual people who participate in the community.
Thank you.
Mr. Alvarado.
Thank you, Patrick. So, about how long is your drive here?
45 minutes.
Is this all a protest to that? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. My question, though, I have 2 parts going into it. One is hearkening to our desire to be classical here, and the medieval town, of course, is people setting up their homes surrounding a monastery or a church. And then we kind of see this today in looking at the structure of many places in Europe. And so communities being founded that way, but I'm more interested in a movement within the Protestant churches that we even have some locally here that have invested in or funded neighborhoods for a couple miles surrounding the church and making them more affordable to parishioners, or to, not parishioners, but, you know, people who go there. I'm wondering if there's a role in the Catholic Church today to maybe harken back to the medieval town and maybe imitate some of our Protestant brothers and sisters. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think, I think that it would certainly be difficult, but if that is a way that we could, as a church, effectively contribute to the formation of community today, I think that would be something we definitely have to consider. You mentioned the medieval town, right? Because the ancients really had this understanding of the importance and the necessity of community, and so they, like you're saying, they had this central location, this church, this monastery, and so through like the physical design of their city, they understood that their lives were centered around that, their religion, right, the church, and then this allowed for just frequent interactions and the building of community through their religion. And so, I think that would be, if the Catholic Church could promote things such as this to encourage, maybe buying land near the church and just encouraging these local communities, because community is a very physically local thing. And so by promoting people to live near the church and to really center their lives around that, and those in the parish that also live near them, could definitely be a way to build up American communities.
Thank you, Patrick. So what you're saying is the ideal of community is sacramental, physical.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, we show our interest in other people and our desire to build community with them through physical connection and physically being near them.
Thank you, Patrick.
Mr. Baker.
I have a lot of thoughts on community. I'm interested in particular the role that technology plays in both the destruction and the building up of local communities. I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I didn't talk a lot about technology in my presentation, or I guess hardly at all, but technology has been another factor in the destruction of community. It tends to, it isolates people, and I think it's tempting to think that these group chats and these connections we have with people online, it's easy. It can seem like that is a community, but my definition of community, and I think this is true, is that it is a very physical, it's a very local thing. It's a sacramental. It's physical as well as internal. So it's easy to see that, and so I think if we rely so much on those fake communities, we don't invest time in our true physical communities. So in that way, they've caused much isolation. They also just encourage, right, they're very individualistic. If you're on your phone, you stay to yourself. You're not talking to people around you. But so in that, it's easy to see how they have destroyed communities, but I think it is true that they can, if used carefully and correctly, kind of like we heard yesterday with Dominic's presentation, there can be some benefits they can offer to, just allowing people to, converse and maybe talk about, physically meeting up and things like that. But as a whole, they tend to harm communities rather than build them.
Any senior questions?
Will.
So there's been a sort of progression of the past two questions. Ms. Alvarado, you talked about the necessity for a community to be like sacramental, like for it to be a physically manifested thing, that we're actually there with people who we say we're in community with. And then with Mr. Baker, we brought up this idea of technology, where it sort of allows us to not think that way. That the people who we work with and who we're at school with, and the things that we do with during the day, we can like pretend like we're actually in community with them because we're allowed to still be in touch with them once we're back home. And then that line from the Gospels came to me. Jesus says to love your neighbor. Doesn't mean you shouldn't love your coworker, shouldn't love your friend or your peer, but he says love your neighbor. So I was wondering, based off the past two questions of we need to be community needs to be a physical thing, and technology allows it to not be a physical thing, how should we like sort of open our eyes to the people who literally live next door to us? And what should our relationship with our neighbors look like? Even if we don't work with them or go to school with them.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So I kind of talked about some things, but it's really a big part of it is just like the physical reality, just being present to your neighbors. So, I think we can think back to, say the 50s and 60s, they were, you'd walk around and you'd hang out with your friends and you'd go on bike rides and you'd all go walk down to the store and get, a milkshake, whatever, this very like communal thing. And today we've lost that because we just stay in our homes, we don't. So physically, like just interacting with your neighbors and just talking to them and doing things with them and encouraging them to do things with you physically, right? Like being present to them is, I think, one thing, or and I gave some examples, right? Just talking, inviting them over to dinner, doing things with them physically, being physically present to them.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you, Patrick. So in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the heat wave and the flood, of how those are kind of some negative, or I guess you were using those to emphasize the importance of community. And so I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more of like why community is good and how we as students can help build our own community here at JPG.
Yeah. So first, why community is good. As I talked a lot about, primarily focused on as Americans, but community is where we learn. In a community, we learn our values, right? A lot of the reason that I think there's so many problems in America today is because we don't have communities, we don't learn values. So in a community, we learn values, we learn how to be a human, we learn how to be an ethical community who has these guiding principles. We learn to respect other people. So that's why community is good. And then how we can build that at JPG, again, back to Dominic's, I think technologies can be very harmful. And I think JPG allows for technology to not be present, but just always being intentional about being physically present is a big part of it, not being so immediately going to technology. And then also things just conversations, just being physically present to those that we're around every day at school, right? I think our primary responsibility is really to those who we live with, those who live in our neighborhood. But we do have a unique opportunity to be at this, great school that does have community, but to continue to encourage it is just to have conversations, to greet people, just to be friendly. I mean, that sounds cliche, but just to really, not just stay to ourselves, not just be independent, but to understand that we do actually rely on those in the JPG community and to just talk to them, be around them.
Thanks, Patrick.
Mary Kate.
So you brought up the idea of X-minute towns, and that sounds like a really nice ideal, but I know like for both of us and for lots of people in the room, like that can't be reality. Like I live like half an hour away, and like my church is I think like 15 minutes away by car, and like all these things. So what are ways that we can start kind of like connecting deeper with our community if it's not, like obviously it's not possible to just like pack up everything and move like in the next few months,
Yeah, thank you for your question. Right, so I guess sort of similar to my answer to Miguel, but it's just this understanding, first of all, that we can't live independently. We have to rely on our community, and so you say, well, okay, well I don't live near people, but it still is just the intentional trying to community. It takes intentionality to build. It's not something that you can't do if you don't try, because it is difficult. It can be difficult. So things such as, obviously there are people that live closer to you, so just maybe, getting to know them. If they're, elderly, maybe offering to help them with stuff. If they have kids, maybe offering to, babysit the kids, and just like getting to know the people around you. But then also, because that is your primary community. But then, like you said, church community and things that you aren't physically close to, but since you are a part of them, just investing time and being present, physically present there, and trying to assist all those that are in that community as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Patrick.